We should maybe give him an award for that too. Next up, we have a presentation on some of the wildlife crossings that are here in Elko County, and mule deer staff specialist Cody Schroeder and Area 7 game biologist Carrie Hubner will present this.
Thank you, Director Wasley, Chairman Drew, members of the Commission. For the record, Cody Schroeder, Staff Specialist, Department of Wildlife. I'm going to be presenting the first half of this today, and my colleague Carrie is going to follow up with the second portion. So I just wanted to give a kind of a broad overview of some of the collaring efforts we've been doing, some of the different aspects of the mule deer program we've been doing over the last couple of years. And I'm just going to kind of touch bases on a few of them and then go into some more detail in a few of the later slides. So we continue to monitor mule deer, both with aerial survey and collaring efforts. We're up to over 800 deer that we've collared going back to 2011. We're using those data to monitor annual survival, to delineate migration corridors, to depict habitat use, and as Carrie's going to get into some more detail on, to identify where and the effectiveness of highway safety crossing structures. Last year, Department of Wildlife contributed over $500,000 to the Department of Transportation in a cooperative agreement for the Pequop Summit Overcrossing project. That's a very costly project. It's a small contribution in the grand scheme of things, but it did go a long way to help, provide support for the project. We did receive $100,000 from the Wildlife Heritage Trust account. I want to thank the members of the Commission for funding that. We used the remaining funds. We used federal aid dollars as the match. We used the Heritage as match for federal aid for that. We also are starting a new project down near Las Vegas. We're calling it the SR-160 project. We're collaring several species of big game, including elk, bighorn sheep, and mule deer. It's another collaborative project with DOT that we're hoping to get a future crossing structure on that SR-160. And again, we obtained matching funds from the Wildlife Heritage Trust account for that, and we're using federal aid funds for the remaining research on that project. I'm going to go over a little bit of the tools that we're trying to develop, help us with some of the data and analysis, the data management side of things. And then, as I mentioned, Carrie's going to follow up with some more real specific stuff about the Area 7 deer herd and crossing structures. And then lastly, we have a short video that was produced by Tim Terrell. Last year, we were able to put out a couple of publications related to the program, related to mule deer, and I just selected a few here. On the left-hand side, this is the cover of a document that several staff in the game division, Chief Wakeling and myself are members of the Mule Deer Working Group, a WAFWA-sponsored working group. We put out this publication on mule deer and movement barriers. It kind of highlights some of the challenges that mule deer are facing with highways, increased restrictions on corridors, oil and gas development, fencing, things like that. It's a west-wide problem, obviously not just unique to Nevada, and there's some really helpful, it's a technical report, some mitigation things we can do, and a lot of the findings from the transportation departments that we kind of collaborated with them on reviewing the document. And then we also had a publication in Frontiers in Microbiology. We looked at BVD, bovine viral diarrhea virus, and actually looked at 3 species in Nevada: bighorn sheep, mountain goats, and mule deer. Dr. Wolf was the primary author on that, and several in the game division were co-authors. And I'll just summarize briefly. This is a figure from the paper that we basically documented that we have BVD and mule deer. And unfortunately, we documented persistently infected animals. Those are the black dots in that figure on the left. That shows this is the Ruby Mountains, shows the migration corridor. The red polygons are stopover locations, and the black dots are where we documented PI animals for BVD. And the unfortunate part is, what the gist of the paper was that we kind of think was going on was that, it probably originally came from livestock, but unfortunately it's endemic in mule deer now, and they may be spreading it to our mountain goats and bighorn sheep populations. The figure on the right there shows the overlap. The green dots are mule deer locations. The blue is bighorn sheep, home range, and the kind of pinkish red is mountain goats. So we know that they're sympatric. This is the East Humboldt range, and we've had transmission between the three species. So some of the migration stuff, this is just showing the kind of the regional stuff here at Elko County here, but we did expand into Lander and White Pine. And overall, you can just see the kind of the gravity of how long distance some of these deer travel. They cross county boundaries, they cross hunt units, and it creates a challenge from a management perspective. The pink up there is the Area 6 deer herd, so Tuscarora Mountains, Independence Mountains. The green shows the migration paths for the Area 7 deer herd, Pequop, Southern Pequop Range. On the lower left there in the blue is Simpson Park Mountains. Not nearly as migratory, but we did document some migratory movements into different parts, different hunt units actually, and across the county boundaries. And then finally we have the Ruby Mountain, East Humboldt migration here. This past year we actually documented one of our longest distance movements. We collared a deer just north of Highway 50. It wintered down near Highway 6 in Area 13, traveled all the way back up through, right through Bald Mountain, and now its summer range is essentially the northern Rubies, right near Secret Pass. So that's a very extensive movement, kind of a path we didn't really know about. This upcoming year we have a new project that's slated for Management Area 14 in the Diamond Mountains. We don't have a whole lot of detail on that, but we're going to be working to develop a proposal and a more specific plan over the summer, hoping to get some callers out this coming winter. This is just a map highlighting some of the preliminary data we've collected in the SR-160 project. So this is Las Vegas, Pahrump. This is the SR-160 highway. And we actually were surprised by this. This is a project that the project lead is Cody McKee in the game division. This is mule deer locations, and we've documented a couple crossings, which is good because DOT is looking for our input on where to place the crossing structures and kind of the most appropriate use of the fencing. But we also discovered we have some smaller migratory movements here in the Spring Mountains that we actually didn't know about. So we're going to use that information for some management recommendations as well. Some of the questions we've looked at in regards to migration, this is kind of just an overall stuff, is what contributes to the timing of migration. Is it snow conditions, temperature, photo period? We'll collect information on body conditions so we can look at the physiological effects on animals, their reproductive status, so whether they're pregnant or they had a fawn last year. And then also we're looking at some of the behavioral stuff like cultural transmission, basically learned behavior from mother to offspring. Some of our research questions, I'll just touch briefly on these. We have many more, but we know we have migration in Nevada. That's no new news, but what we don't really have a total grasp on is, the different variation in migration. So we kind of delineate them here into these three different categories. Obligate migration strategy. This is probably really typical here in Elko County, the Ruby Mountains, for instance, where deep snow at higher elevations force the deer down low. That's a pretty obvious one. One that's trickier to define is this facultative or partial migration strategy, where we see deer that they migrate in some years but not in others, or they only migrate a small distance depending on the severity of the winter. That's a little more difficult to tackle from a management standpoint. And then we have this third strategy that we know we have. It's a resident strategy where we don't see movements outside of their normal home range. Usually these occur in agricultural areas or areas where we just don't have significant weather events where there's forage available year-round. This is something that we just have been working with the diversity division on, actually. And one of the problems we came up with all these collars we've been employing is they collect a tremendous amount of data. I think we're near 2 million GPS locations just on mule deer alone. And so housing those in a database that you can access actually becomes a challenge, and querying the data and making it accessible. This is a tool, it's a web tool that was developed by Mitch Gritz. It allows us to query data, pick date ranges. This is the front end of it. In this case, I'm selecting the Area 6 deer. It shows a map of it. You can pick individual deer, click on them, query it by date, things like that if you want to get more specific. It also has these analysis tools, which I'm going to get into. Just some brief overview. When you select an animal here, normally this kind of analysis is, in terms of data management, you collect the data either from the collar or you get it from a satellite. You have to download it on your computer. Then you've got to put it into a minimum of 2 different software programs, conduct some analyses, and then make the maps. But what Mitch did is developed a front-end tool that does all that, eliminates a lot of that software and needing to transfer files. So this is projecting an animal home range. He's got the 25, 50, and 90% contours on here, so you can estimate home range sizes and things like that right from the interface. Along with that, we can do a lot more detailed analysis. So this helps us to kind of define when the migrations happen and different strategies, as I mentioned before. So in that same app, this plots for each animal the distance that they traveled in a crude sense. This is their displacement distance, and then you have date here along the x-axis. So each one of these graphs is a different animal. So this sort of allows us to graphically depict their movements. And just looking across the board, you can see sort of different strategies. So this upper one in blue is what we consider a resident deer. You know, it didn't move far from where we caught it. It stayed there throughout the year. There is some noise in the data there. If you just compare that to one below, this is where we caught the animal on summer range. It did a large distance, movement here. It spent the entire winter. So this was its winter range. Then it migrated back in the summer. It didn't move around much in the summer. Then it migrated again. But if you just jump over to the next one, you can see that these are the same exact timeline here. The same animals captured in the same animal. This animal migrated 2 years. This animal migrated the first year, but it didn't migrate the second year. And so this tool is kind of helping us analyze some of this data in a more efficient way than just sort of plotting the data on maps. This is just kind of more showing an actual map example of that different strategy we see. So this would be a resident strategy on the left panel. This is 2 collars from the Ruby Mountains. So just for a reference, this is southern end of 101, 102. You got Harrison Pass. The animals were captured in roughly the same spot. This is 2 different animals near the Barnes Ranch, actually, where this is. This animal did not migrate, but the same year, this animal went over 120 kilometers, so it, crossed the southern Rubies, Overland Pass, went through Bald Mountain, and its final winter range is down here near Buck Mountain. This is Orchard Canyon, if you're familiar with the Ruby Mountains. So this is just kind of a summary of some of the different variation we've seen. These different pie charts represent study areas. So we have the Ruby Mountains up here on the left. You can see that the vast majority of the ruby deer are migratory. So if you combine, this is sort of the partial definition where maybe they migrated 1 year but not the other, and then complete migrants. Only about 20% of those deer herd are what we'd consider residents. If you just contrast that over here with the Simpson Park, so this would be Area 15, Management Area 15, vast majority of those deer are actually resident deer, and only a smaller percentage of them are true migrants. And then we also have Carson Range on here. It's kind of a halfway in between, where you see about half the deer are migratory and half are resident. So that's all I have. I'm going to pass it over to my colleague, Carrie Hubner. If you have any questions specific to mine, I can answer those, or I can just move on to Carrie.
Questions for Cody? Paul? Cody, on that previous slide you were showing the migratory, in some of the units you had larger migratory animals. Is that a genetic response? Is that something they're born with?
Well, it's not so much genetic. If you notice one of those first slides I had behavior on there. So what we think it is actually more of a learned behavior from, it's kind of what we call cultural transmission, just like you pass on information to your kids about, reading or something like that. the paths are actually learned, what we think, between the offspring and the adults. But there can be some variation there. So we have dispersers, that might move to a new area, in which case they just follow other deer. They're social animals, so they get in groups, and eventually they learn the migration paths that way.
Thanks. Commissioner Blitz?
Commissioner Blitz.
Have you been able to, in the spring or winter, look at deer that, like the two deer that you captured that were not next to each other and one migrated and one didn't? Were you able to look at body condition come spring on a particular deer that may migrate and some that don't, just to see if the deer that do migrate do better than the ones that are stayed resident?
Yeah, so we have looked at that. We collected body condition. Unfortunately, it's not an entirely clear picture. What we think is happening is the reason these strategies exist, the different strategies, because in different years it may be more beneficial to stay and not migrate. Let's say you have an agricultural field that has year-round forage, and in those cases we see deer are in better condition. But for instance, if you had a heavy winter and deer that stayed for whatever reason because they don't know the migration path, you'd expect those to be in poor condition, whereas maybe the long-distance migrator was in better condition because they moved out of that, they found the food source. And so we did find a relationship between body condition and survival, though. So those that were in better condition survived better overall.
Additional questions? Thank you, Cody.
I really appreciate being here today. As I got this presentation ready, I realized there's been some huge successes for the Area 7 deer herd, and I got here in 2003, and discussions were already in full swing about concerns about deer crossing and safety on our highways. Constantly we're hearing about Pequop and Pequop Summit, which is on I-80 and Highway 93. But discussions really started in earnest with our partners, Nevada Department of Transportation, in 2006. We realized that there was something that needed to be done. We'd known about these migration patterns of Area 7 since the 50s when some of the studies had been done. Obviously, seeing the hits on the highway we were very well aware of. But as I-80 was built through the migration path and just traffic increases, we noticed it was a growing problem. And number one, safety for folks that are traveling these highways. So it's a little bit tough. In 2000 to 2002, Utah did a study about trying to use warning signals and that to warn motorists that there would be deer in the area and there were migrations going on. What they found was as soon as the signs went up, people paid attention and were cautious, and then a week later, everything was back to normal. You've got, obviously, people that are locals that are very well aware of the migrations and what's going on. You've got folks that it's their first time through and don't have a clue to be cautious. So, but during that time, they spent a little bit of extra effort trying to figure out how many deer they thought were being hit. A lot of them we had to partner with the highway patrolmen because they were getting called out on accidents. But the reasons why it's so tough to do this, you've got a whole bunch of hits that are unreported completely. And then DOT does a great job of trying to capture that. But in tough times when they're plowing snow, et cetera, the deer are moved off, the deer die off of the roadway. They're obviously not seeing those and not reporting those. Sometimes deer get injuries that they die several days later from. So anyway, as best we could tell, at that time around the 2000s, there was about 300 deer possibly per migration that were getting struck by vehicles on 93 and I-80. This is just specific to Area 7. And at that time, I mean, it was getting close to where there were probably as many deer being hit on the roadways as there was being harvested by hunters. It was a pretty significant mortality going on in that herd. So a lot of discussions, a lot of meetings were happening. We were all very cautious and nervous. There wasn't a lot. Now overpasses and wildlife crossings and that are becoming a lot more popular. At the time, it wasn't. We were very concerned about picking the right location. We ended up choosing 10 Mile, which is literally 10 miles north of Wells on Highway 93. And this site was chosen just because, let me bring this up. So this is a map that DOT produced, and the way they calculate crashes is how many crashes per 2-mile segment. And as you can see from the legend there, the red is 21 to 37, and this is per year that this is generated. What you see in the light areas here is migrations of mule deer. This is kind of an older corridor. We probably could have updated this. But as you can see, like we were seeing for 7, you've got the segment of the population, maybe half to 60% of the Area 7 deer herd will leave the Jarbidge Mountains in the southern part, come down here, cross I-93, either at HD Summit or this 10-mile, and then they continue on to the Pequops, going through Pequop Summit. Some of them will come over here and cross at Silver Zone. And so as you can see, there was 3 spots on that migration path that came up in the red. While I've got this map up, I'll point out, you can see around this is Spring Creek over here. There's lots of deer moving around in our residential area and a lot of strikes. This is Hunter over towards Carlin there, where some of the Area 6 migrating deer have incidences. But anyway, we chose 10-mile summit as the first was, like I say, density of hits and constructability. We found that it was really imperative that we had biological reasons why we want to do things, but then when the engineers got involved, we want to make sure that those mesh up. And luckily, right there at 10-mile, there was a cut that was already there that just made it really efficient to put an overpass in and try it. Okay, so this is a 10-mile overpass. It was completed in July of 2010. It was a $1.8 million project. Some of those funds came from us, from Nevada Department of Wildlife, and then a lot was the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act. What normally helps with the funding with this are federal safety funds, and DOT had secured a bunch of these for this 10-mile project, but it came right as the stimulus funds came in. So they actually were able to use the American Recovery and Investment Act funding for this, and then it's kind of like a snowball. Then they were able to save monies and use more for more crossings. So it's really been a successful project in that it just keeps going, and we've been able to find the funding to make these still happen. So this is 10-mile here, as I mentioned. As you can notice on this particular one, it's a really nice site because of the cut in there. The deer, when they're actually on the crossing, and when you're standing up there, it's like you don't even know you're on a crossing. It's just dirt, and then next thing you know, you're on the other side. And so that's been really successful, I think was part of some of the reasons why that was so successful. Then there was 2 other undercrossings that were built at the 10-mile site, one on the northern part of the overpass and the other one on the southern part, and then another undercrossing that was put in at HD. These undercrossings are to complement. It was kind of a little bit of an experiment to see how the deer reacted to overpass versus undercrossings. The undercrossings are less expensive, so if we could get away with that, that would be a good option. And then, of course, we've got to put the exclusionary fencing in, and that's to funnel the deer to the sites where they're going to cross. There's a group of deer right here. That first year was a little challenging, for them to figure out, but once they've figured it out, it's been working well since then. This undercrossing here, we've kind of found that we've got the openness ratio correct. Deer really prefer more open. They want to know that they can see the other side and that. And one thing that we would change now that is apparent in this photo is if you can see sky on the other side, if you can develop them to where they can actually see sky, it's a little bit better and they feel a little bit more comfortable, but they do use these sites as well. And then this is HD Overpass, which I said was about another 10 miles to the north, and it was completed in the spring of 2011. This one was a little bit tougher. They're all, with all projects, very challenging with the right-of-ways. There's private and public right-of-ways and how much you can go off of the right-of-way to put these in. But this one was chosen right at the summit, and they actually lowered the roadway to put this one in, but it's much more of a hill. They go up and over. We were a little bit concerned that might be an issue, but it hasn't proved to be so. And then DOT was doing a paving project over here at Silver Zone, which is just west of Wendover. and they were able to put one of these overcrossings in here. It wasn't necessarily NDOW's. It was definitely a hit spot that we were concerned about, but it wasn't exactly our highest priority, but what was great is these things can just dovetail into these projects, and they got it with federal safety funds on this one. And the unique part about this is how many, I mean, it's one of the first ones on I-80 in the entire country, and then also too, it's got 2 different tunnels going over the lanes, and there are 3, there's a climbing lane on the westbound and then 2 on the eastbound. So it's actually going over 5 lanes of traffic, which is a pretty substantial project. And then now Pequop Summit, you heard Cody mention, they're working on that right now. It's going to be going on all summer, so apologies in advance for all that construction that's going on I-80, but they're going to do 2 overpasses and 2 underpasses. That's a huge swath of migration. They're going over the entire summit there. So, and underpasses can take on a lot of different designs, and this one I chose this picture just to show you, one, how many people get involved with these field tours and figuring things out. But this is one of the interchanges. Whoops. Back there. This is one of the interchanges, and this is actually where vehicles can go through. But what they're going to do is cut these banks back and funnel deer to there, and so the deer can actually go under these big, large bridges. This gets very, very little traffic. It's going to be another little experiment to see how successful that's going to be, but that's the strategy that's going to be used there. We expect that to be done by this fall, but as I'm learning with a lot of these contracting, it doesn't always go as planned. They run into a lot of things that they weren't anticipating, but hopefully it'll be completed before this fall migration. So that was kind of the overview of what's been going on in Elko County and for the Area 7 deer herd in particular. And the big question was always, so do they work? You know, there's people that say, oh, I've never seen a deer on the crossing, and this and that. It was really important, even for us that were concerned about the successfulness of it, that we document that they truly were successful in working. We started with, we hired then JBR, now Stantec, to kind of look at some behavioral things, what the deer did when they encountered the exclusionary fence and how much stress it was bringing, and if they were figuring it out. And then Nova Simpson with UNR actually did a graduate study, and she started in 2010 and went to spring of 2013. She got 2 full migration cycles, meaning fall and spring on 10 Mile, and then got 1 full cycle on HD. And so I'll keep it specific to 10 Mile because that's what she had the most data on. But there was over 16,000 crossings in 4 migrations, meaning 2 falls and 2 springs. 82% of the deer use the overpass and 18% use the undercrossings. What we found is we had more using the undercrossings, I think, while the deer were trying to figure out what was going on. But now that they know about the overpass, I bet it's 90% to date. They've really figured that out and just go right to it. So if you think about that, I was figuring that out, and you know, since it's been in place, it's probably 36,000 potential deer vehicle collisions that have been avoided just at that one crossing alone, which is a great thing to think of when we're thinking about people and safety on the roadways. And then, so at 10 Mile, they were reduced. So everybody wants to know if this actually reduced the collisions, and because we put them in the right spot, it did. Each year they were reduced by 50% to where now there's maybe 1 a year, and it's usually outside the exclusionary fencing, one just that got on the outside or something there. And then, you know, the average cost of a deer vehicle collision is $4,290, and there's a lot of, I mean, people talk about the cost of the crossings, which they're substantial. However, the cost of human life is obviously priceless, and then these deer vehicle collisions, just with insurance, et cetera, is really expensive as well. DOT's this has been such a win-win for everybody because we're keeping humans a lot safer out there, while meanwhile maintaining these migration corridors that the mule deer need, you know, to get to their winter ranges and be successful. Just as a side note, other things that she found, we had the first documented, so she set up cameras, by the way, on the crossings, and that's how we got all these counts and everything. But she got the first successful documentation of a pronghorn antelope using the overpass. They now have specific overpasses in Wyoming for pronghorn, but ours was the first one to be documented. And just everything, badgers, coyotes, elk, jackrabbits, cottontails, fox, lots of different birds seen there, and then domestic stock. She got more of mules and cattle than I'm sure she cared to count at the end of it. But that was the other thing that we hadn't thought initially, but we have had to, these crossings are for wildlife, but yet we have to be careful that we're not allowing the cattle to go across them and end up in the wrong allotment. So we do have to put a fence over the crossing. So let me see. Oh, and one other thing, we're going to play this video by Tim Terrell. He is working, he's our contract videographer for Nevada Department of Wildlife, and he's got time-lapse cameras up on the Pequop crossings as they're being built, and is just really been awesome trying to document some of these crossings and get it out there so that we can share this information with the public. And one other thing, since we were talking about ravens, which you might just in a second. That was another thought I was having the other day, is that if you think about it, we used to have over 300 deer hit there, and we've taken away, hopefully, that source of mortality on the deer, but then also maybe a raven subsidy. It was nothing to just see ravens lined up all the way I-93 in the Pequop just waiting for deer to get hit. It obviously was a huge source of food. So I like to think that these projects have been successful in reducing some of that subsidy for ravens as well, helping out the sage grouse. So I'll let you guys just watch this video quickly, and then we can take questions.
This program highlights the annual migration of mule deer in eastern Nevada. The migration begins in the Pequop Mountains during the spring of each year. They migrate over 100 miles north-northwest to the Jarbidge Mountains. Their journey has its challenges, crossing two highways, I-80 and Highway 93, and more than 60 fence lines. Roadway crossings pose high risk to both humans and wildlife. Wildlife biologists and researchers estimate that vehicles may kill as many deer in Utah every year as hunters do. Because many vehicle and animal collisions occur at night, a 9-hour time lapse was created along I-80 in the Pequop range from sundown to sunrise. Over the course of the time lapse, the traffic flow is relentlessly constant, and it's only going to increase. Imagine the confusion for the animals and the increased risk for motorists. In an effort to reduce vehicle-wildlife collisions, Department of Transportation places signs along the highway to warn motorists wildlife could be on the roadway. However, that has been met with limited success. Most human injuries and fatalities occur when the motorist swerves off the road to avoid hitting the animals. So that begs the question, how do we increase human safety and decrease roadkill? Wildlife crossings, or also referred to as safety structures, are the best option. They've been used worldwide. As an example, this crossing along the Trans-Canadian Highway. Crossings have been located throughout Nevada, including several to benefit bighorn sheep, mule deer, elk, feral horses, and desert tortoise. As of March 2016, 2 additional crossings are currently under construction along I-80 in eastern Nevada. One on the western slope and one on the eastern slope of the Pequop Mountains. Crossings are considered effective when they reduce wildlife collisions and restore wildlife movement between fragmented habitats. Proper fencing is needed to keep the wildlife off the highway and guide them to the structures. The fence is 8 feet tall with small openings to prevent animals from getting on the roadway. Once wildlife arrives at the crossing, they gather next to a rail fence. It's designed to keep livestock from using the crossing. It doesn't take long before the deer hop over or slide under and cross the structure. One of the tools biologists use to monitor mule deer is a radio collar. The collars allow biologists to follow the movement of the individual deer throughout the year as they move from winter to summer ranges. Deer have an incredible sense of smell. They sniff the ground and smell other deer and determine they're on the right path. If you listen closely, you can hear the cars passing under the structure. Once the deer have crossed the structure, they relax and go about browsing. It's so nice when a plan comes together. The deer use the crossing, highway traffic flows uninterrupted with no danger to humans or wildlife. When you see one of these structures, know that it's the result of a lot of hard work by Nevada Department of Transportation, Nevada Department of Wildlife, and many other agencies.
Anybody have any questions?
Questions? Seeing none, thanks for the
All right,
presentation.
thank you.